Image stabilization got amazingly good meanwhile. ISO noise is also not a problem anymore with modern cameras. You can shoot images in dusky conditions, freehand, and you get out fantastic photographs. So is there still a need for a tripod actually? We will talk about that in this video. Hi my friends, very nice to see you. I often get questions, especially from beginners, something like, Christian, do I really need a tripod? I feel much more flexible without. And if you watch my videos on a regular basis, you know, some weeks ago there happened something. I was out for hiking up a mountain for taking some awesome photographs, but I forgot my tripod in my car. Oh man, in more than 30 years, this never happened to me before. I forgot spare batteries. I also forgot, I think, my memory card one time, but I never forgot my tripod. But the thing is, I anyway got out some fantastic photographs on that day, freehand, in foggy conditions in the early morning. And this raised questions for some of you. I got lots of messages if the usage of tripods has maybe got obsolete meanwhile. And I'm used to get questions like that, to be honest. But it was the first time that it got not only asked by beginners, but also by more experienced photographers. And I think this is a really interesting question. So are tripods obsolete? Let's dive in. First of all, let's have a look why we had to use a tripod some years ago and earlier. And the most obvious situation was a scene with moving elements, longer exposures maybe, where we simply wanted to make this movement visible. Just think about a nice water scene or blurry clouds due to motion blur or something like that. We needed anything that stabilized our camera and just made the motion visible. And this was done by a tripod. The tripod holds our camera and we capture the movement. But today, most cameras have in-body stabilization, what allows you to use around 5 times longer shutter speeds, freehand. And also ISO noise is much better than it was 10 years ago, for instance. And I don't have a problem to take a photograph with ISO of 1000 or something like that. And this all makes tripods obsolete, doesn't it? And before I answer this question, let's have a look at another use case we shouldn't forget. When we changed from film to digital photography, we had to realize that the dynamic range of a digital sensor is not as good as it was on film. Now that's a fact. A film has a better dynamic range than a digital sensor. And this ended up that brighter areas got too bright on digital photography, darker areas got too dark. But there was, and there still is, a way to compensate for that. And we can simply use exposure bracketing therefore. And this means that we take multiple exposures for one and the same scene, but with different shutter speeds. And in the easiest situation, this could mean that we take one normal exposure, one underexposed and one overexposed, just as an example. And either we make an each out of these exposures later with Lightroom, for instance, or we blend them together in Photoshop. And in the past, we always needed a tripod therefore, because when we want to blend photos, they should be exactly the same, right? But meanwhile, digital cameras have even the function to do exposure bracketing automatically. This means when I turn on bracketing on my camera, it exposes 3, 5 or 7 times with different shutter speeds. And when I use 3 exposures for bracketing, what is enough for the most cases to be honest, the delay between the exposures is just a fraction of a second. And this makes it even possible to use exposure bracketing when you shoot freehand. And that's amazing. So however we try to turn it, it really looks like that a tripod has got totally obsolete. I forgot my tripod some weeks ago, as already mentioned, and let me be absolutely honest with you. On that day, I got some fantastic photographs through. I'm really happy with them. I even offer some of them as fine art prints on my web shop. but I struggled massively to get them. I did really hard, and I think this photo day makes quite good visible why it is such a good idea to use a tripod. Also today, although we have this amazing technology with exposure bracketing, with image stabilization, and the possibility to use a higher ISO. First of all, I needed a quite high depth of field for most of my photographs on that day, as I had a really close foreground. You know, I want to get my entire scene sharp from the foreground to the distance, not only my subject layer or the main characters of my scene. This has some prehistoric reasons. I will not go into detail here. I mentioned this already sometimes in my videos, and this is why we usually don't want to have bokeh in our landscape photographs. There are exceptions, but usually we don't want. We can close the aperture to increase the depth of field to make more of our scene sharp, but when we close it too much, we get diffraction. The entire photograph looks soft and washed out. So when we get too close to a foreground, the chance is high that there's no aperture on your lens you could use, that everything gets sharp. The only possibility in this case is to focus stack. And on that day, I needed to focus stack actually, but I didn't have a tripod to me. So I was not able to focus stack, but the image got anyway absolutely sharp. So what have I done? Well, I simply put my focus point more to the foreground, as much as necessary to get my foreground sharp as well. There are different ways how to focus, and I made already a video about how and where to focus in landscape photography. I will link it up here for you so that you can watch it after this video. So I simply shifted my focus point a little bit more to the front, as I had usually done. And this worked through, but it really didn't. For one of the photos I had even to go to f/18. And this is just possible with a very good lens. And I use G-Master lenses from Sony, and they are really amazingly good at that point of view. You can stop down to f/18 and you get still pin-sharp photographs. I have linked my entire gear list below in the description, just for the case that one was interested in my setup. So focus stacking is one thing where I really prefer a tripod, or where I simply need one, to be honest. And I had needed this for each single photo on that day, but there's something else where I see a big advantage with using a tripod. But before I tell you more about that, my friends, if you like this video, please consider to give me a thumb up to make this video better found on YouTube. I thank you therefore. You know, I talk a lot about composition in my videos, and the reason therefore is simply it is one of the most important things in photography. It is even the base requirement for getting great photographs. You could have luck with the weather or with the light or something like that in some situations, but I never saw a photographer having luck with the composition. You know, you could stumble over perfect light, but you can't stumble over perfect composition. And you know, there are different things to be considered in composition. Finding the right balance, considering color, considering lines, patterns, shapes, and so on. And everything you consider should support the story of your image, or the story your image tells. I think this is even the most important thing actually. So when we don't only want to get a snapshot, we need to work deep into our compositions, we need to fine-tune them. And the argument I often hear is, but I'm able to hold the camera really quiet, I don't need a tripod. Well, you know, I have really lots of practice with holding this black thing here in my hands, and when I was 18, I was in the army, like most of the young men here in Austria, and there I learned how to shoot and how you should breathe, that you hit finally. And as my daughter was a biathlon athlete for some years, you know, running with the skis and shooting, and yes, she shoot with small caliber back then, and I engaged really deep with how to target, how to breathe, and how to hold your device as quiet as possible. And biathlon, you even consider not to transmit your pulse to the gun. That's amazing, isn't it? We're really talking about micro vibrations here. They make a big difference in biathlon, and the principle is absolutely the same with the camera. So I also think that I'm able to hold my camera really quiet. But the thing is, also when you are really good at that, you anyway move around a tiny bit. There's nothing better, really nothing, for stabilizing your composition than a tripod. And as composition is that important, I need to get it right, really right. I have to nail it if I want to get a masterpiece. And for me this usually means that I build up the composition, or a rough composition first, and then I begin with fine-tuning on my tripod. And usually the closer I am to a foreground, the less I have to move around with my camera position to fine-tune the composition. There are even cases where I just move 1 or 2 millimeters around and this would already make a big difference. A tripod is really useful for this fine-tuning process. But the thing is, we don't only need the perfect composition, we also need the right timing. And maybe we have to wait for the right light. Maybe we have to wait that the fog gets a tiny bit tighter in the backdrop, a fog moves around with the wind and gets a tiny bit more resolved and tighter again. So timing is absolutely important here. Or maybe you just have to wait that the cloud moves there where you want to have it in your composition, that it balances anything else in your composition, whatever it is. Rebuilding the composition afterwards, when the timing is right, is quite difficult if it should not get just a snapshot. And this is the reason why tripods are not obsolete for me. Tripods are still the best fine-tuning instrument for my landscape photography. I go into setup, I fine-tune, I wait for the right timing and then I make the click. And of course, there are situations where you have to react as fast as possible, where we don't have time to bring our tripod into setup. Sometimes we have to shoot just out of the hip to get the scene with the amazing light spot or with the amazing rainbow before it disappears after a few seconds only. And then it is important that you're also able to shoot without a tripod. But I can highly recommend you, if you want to improve your photography, use a tripod most of the time. And you need a sturdy tripod, but you don't need the most expensive one in the world. I use tripods from Rolei. My main tripod is this Lion Rock 25, and for steeper mountain tours I use my C6i Carbon from Rolei, as it has less weight. I will link both of them down in my description, that you can check them out by yourself. I think they are not available all over the world though, but it could already be useful for you just to have a look and compare it with other brands. So yeah, I forgot my tripod on that day, but I anyway got out some fantastic photographs. And if you're interested about this photo tour, I will link the video here for you. And give me a thumb up if you like this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you next Saturday. Bye.
I'm the landscape you need to see. You are the artist I'll never be.